By the early 14th century, the Knights Templar had built something that had never existed before: an international financial network that stretched from London to Jerusalem. Their innovation was deceptively simple. A pilgrim could deposit money at a Templar preceptory in Paris, carrying nothing but a coded letter of credit. Withdraw equivalent funds upon reaching the Holy Land. This eliminated the greatest obstacle to long-distance commerce and travel, carrying physical wealth through lawless territory. Over 2 centuries, the order had refined this system into the most sophisticated banking operation the medieval world had ever seen. They held deposits for merchants, extended credit to nobles, managed estates, and collected revenues on behalf of the church. Their fortress in Paris functioned as the central bank of France in all but name. At various points, the French treasury itself was administered from within its walls. Kings borrowed from the Templars because there was simply no one else who could lend at the scale sovereignty demanded. The system worked, and it worked because everyone involved believed it would continue to work. That belief was about to be tested by a king who had run out of options. Dawn broke gray and heavy over Paris on the morning of October 13, 1307. Royal messengers slipped through the streets carrying sealed orders, their breath visible in the autumn chill. Behind the magnificent facades of Gothic splendor that proclaimed France's supremacy, the kingdom's finances had reached a breaking point that few outside the royal council understood. Philip IV, the Iron King, had spent years waging wars against England, battling the papacy for political supremacy and maintaining a court whose appetites outpaced every source of revenue. The silver content of French coins had been debased so many times that merchants in Flanders and Italy had begun refusing them. Inflation was eating the kingdom from within. The treasury was not merely low, it was functionally empty. And the single largest obligation weighing on the crown's books was the accumulated debt owed to the Knights Templar. The relationship between Philip and the order had begun as one of mutual convenience. The Templars provided credit. The king provided protection and political legitimacy. But the debt did not stop growing simply because the king wished it would not. Each year, the debt grew. Each payment consumed a larger share of royal revenue. By 1307, the obligation had reached a scale where honest repayment would have required Philip to accept austerity measures. No medieval king could survive politically. The Templars were not merely his creditors. They had become an institution whose continued existence was a standing reminder of the crown's financial subordination. They answered not to Philip, but to the Pope. Their wealth was international, their loyalties supranational, and their financial leverage over France was growing with every compounding cycle. In Philip's council chamber, the question was no longer how to service the debt. It was how to escape it. He had already exhausted the conventional options. In 1306, he had expelled the Jewish moneylenders from France and seized their property, a crude but effective short-term extraction that provided temporary liquidity and set a dangerous precedent. He had raised taxes on the peasantry until there was nothing left to extract. He had debased the currency until the debasement itself became a source of instability. The crown was spending beyond its means, sinking deeper into debt each year. Philip needed a radical solution. The debt itself had to cease to exist. Working with his chief minister, Guillaume de Nogaret, Philip began building a case. Not a financial case, but a spiritual one. The Templars would be declared heretics. If the institution itself could be erased, the debt would vanish with it. Philip sought an end to the problem entirely, leaving no creditor to demand payment. Propaganda moved first. Accusations began circulating, whispered at first. They were accused of denying Christ, spitting on the cross, and worshipping Baphomet. These charges had no basis in evidence, but they did not need to. The Templars, once holy warriors, became agents of spiritual corruption. In the medieval mind, heresy dissolved all other obligations. Philip was not a debtor seizing assets, but a defender of the faith. The arrests on that Friday morning were executed with military precision. In Paris, Jacques de Molay, the Grand Master, was seized. Across France, Templar preceptories awakened to pounding on their gates. By nightfall, hundreds of knights had been dragged to dungeons. Royal officials breached the Templar treasury, cataloging its contents. They focused on the ledgers, the parchment records of who owed what. These pages contained an uncomfortable reality. The King of France was the greatest debtor. Philip was determined to make this uncomfortable truth disappear entirely. As royal officials seized coin, bullion, plate, and precious objects, they also methodically collected the documentation of the crown's debts. In many cases, these records were destroyed. Philip's debt was not restructured, refinanced, or formally defaulted upon. It was simply made to not exist, erased along with the institution that had recorded it. The dungeons became the machinery that manufactured legitimacy for what had already been accomplished in the counting rooms. Within days of the arrests, the torture began. Royal inquisitors applied red-hot irons, crushed limbs and vices, suspended men by their wrists. Under such duress, men confessed to whatever was demanded. Each signed confession justified the seizure that was already underway. The confessions came after the seizures had begun. They allowed Philip to present this sovereign theft as an act of pious duty. He was not stealing, he was saving Christendom. He was not defaulting, he was defending the faith. The economic consequences radiated outward from Paris with a speed that surprised even Philip's advisors. Merchants with Templar letters of credit found themselves holding worthless paper. Pilgrims with deposited funds were stranded, their money inaccessible. The system they had trusted dissolved overnight. Banking operations facilitating European commerce for decades simply ceased to function. Italian banking houses, the Bardi, Peruzzi, and nascent Medici networks watched with careful attention, drawing immediate conclusions. They limited their loans to the French crown. They developed new instruments to obscure their holdings from royal seizure. They began demanding more in return. Now aware of a danger they had not faced before, that a sovereign borrower might choose to destroy his creditor. The price of borrowing across Europe rose. Transactions that had been routine became cautious and complex. Trust, the invisible infrastructure on which all credit depends, had been damaged at a deep level. Philip's immediate gains were substantial. The movable wealth of the Templars flowed into royal coffers. The landed estates were nominally transferred to the Knights Hospitaller, but the crown extracted enormous fees. Philip had not merely cancelled his debt, it acquired sudden wealth that temporarily masked the underlying weakness of his kingdom's finances. The pressure was relieved. The creditor was gone. The ledgers were ash. But the relief was temporary, and the damage was permanent. In the years that followed, the consequences of Philip's action compounded in ways that no seizure of Templar gold could offset. Merchants developed sophisticated methods to hide wealth from the French crown. Credit became more expensive as lenders demanded higher returns. This was to compensate for the demonstrated risk of lending to French sovereignty. Money that might have come into French commerce found safer homes in Italian city-states. Their property was not subject to the whims of a single indebted monarch. The financial instruments that fueled the European economy became more complex, guarded, and less efficient. This was in the shadow of what Philip had done. He had solved the problem of debt by destroying a system of credit. The consequences would take generations to unfold. The final act came 7 years later. Jacques de Moy had endured imprisonment. Initially, he confessed under torture, but then retracted his confession publicly. On March 18, 1314, he was burned at the stake on a small island in the Seine. As the flames rose, the last Grand Master reportedly called upon Philip and Pope Clement V. He called them to meet him before God's judgment within the year. Clement died within weeks. Philip followed within months. Whether coincidence or something else, their deaths did nothing to resolve the underlying problem. Philip's successors inherited a throne still addicted to spending beyond its means, still dependent on borrowed money, but now faced those who remembered what the French crown had done. The banking techniques the Templars had pioneered would eventually be reborn and refined. This happened at a careful distance from the reach of the French monarchy. What Philip had demonstrated was something subsequent centuries would confirm again and again. A sovereign borrower who cannot repay his debts always has one option no private debtor possesses. He can redefine the creditor as an enemy. He can transform a financial obligation into a crime. He can replace the language of repayment with the language of purification. The Templars had made themselves indispensable to a king who resented his own dependence. They had allowed a single borrower to dominate their exposure. They had trusted that their spiritual status and international reach would protect them. They trusted from the temporal power of a cornered monarch. They were wrong. The debt that Philip refused to pay honestly did not disappear. It was merely transformed into inflation, into capital flight, into the long memory of those who lent money, would treat French sovereign promises with suspicion for generations. The ledger was burned, but the balance was collected all the same. Not by bankers, but by the slow, compounding cost of a kingdom that had taught its creditors never to trust it again.